Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. So, in answering what's next, I want to talk about a project, actually, that's not in downtown Brooklyn. It's in Williamsburg that our office is doing shop. We designed the Barclays Center, which we're very, very proud of here in downtown Brooklyn. So why do I think what's happening at Domino Sugar really represents not just what's next for Brooklyn, but actually what's next for much of the world? We're going to be at about 10 billion people by the end of this century, and we have to find smart, sustainable, socially just ways in which to accommodate that growth. And one of the things that we're probably going to move away from is the traditional hub and spoke city, this notion that we all work in one place, commute there. I took the subway here. There are 8 subway lines underneath the East River. What do you think the odds are of us building a 9th in our lifetime? Right? It's very, very hard for us to build that kind of infrastructure. We have to think about a different way of using the territory of the city. And I think what Domino represents is actually this notion that it's going to be much more of a polycentric city, that we're going to live, work, and play across all 5 boroughs, and not just think of this one central business district in Manhattan. And that is tied to this shift in terms of what's happened with cities. And that cities used to be sort of mono-industry places, whether it was Hollywood and money, Washington and power, look at the House of Cards, or New York and this notion of the financial industry really driving what happened in New York. But a funny thing has happened in the last 10 years. We have 300,000 new technology jobs in this city. Finance is being paired with fashion, media, the creative technologies. And we're finding a new geography for those jobs to play out and to access them in a different way. And I think one of the things we need to do as city planners and architects is think about the village and the idea of the village, where you could walk to work, walk to church, walk your kids to school, but tie that to all of the technological advancements that we've had over the last several decades, and think about what is this new sort of global innovation village. And so that means moving away from the 20th century model of isolated communities, isolated companies, isolated academic institutions separated by highways, and instead think about the way in which we can mix all of that together in what I like to call sort of knowledge-oriented development. So if you think about the notion that culture and education and knowledge could actually be at the heart of what drives urban growth instead of just money or power. And that has to be done in an era of climate change, thinking about our waterfronts in a different way. And nowhere is this playing out more, I would argue, than on the East River. We used to think about the East River as the center of, the edge of our city. It is increasingly becoming the center of our city. 50 million square feet is online in the development pipeline, all up and down the East River. And so instead of thinking about ourselves as boroughs that are separated, it's really the river that is our glue. And the Domino site sits right at the bend of the East River, has extraordinary views up to Midtown, down to Lower Manhattan, and across Brooklyn. It's about 11 acres. It's close to, it's about 2/3 of the size of the World Trade Center site, has a 1/4 mile of waterfront, of post-industrial waterfront. And so the Wilentises, one of the great architectural clients in the history of humanity, I have to say, came to us. They bought this site after it had gone through a 7-year-long entitlement process. They came to us and they said, we could build what was approved, we can make a lot of money, but I don't want to spend the next 10 years doing that. Prove to us that we should go through entitlements all over again in order to build a different kind of neighborhood. And so this is what we sort of inherited, these low, blocky buildings that are in the floodplain. All the streets ended in cul-de-sacs. It was very suburban. And so we actually said, let's push the buildings back from the water, actually take one of the sites next to the sugar refinery, which is a landmark, and vacate all the density from it. And then, because these buildings were then getting taller, because it was the same amount of density, actually aerate them with a series of apertures, and actually make light and air come back into the heart of Williamsburg. And that would allow us to bring River Street through, connect up the grid, and create these small blocks, which is something that Jane Jacobs wrote about quite a bit, and then try to break down each building scale in terms of looking at the scale of Williamsburg, which in many places is quite low, 40 to 60 feet, and have elements that are that scale, and then have elements that are sort of the refinery scale, 150 to 200 feet, and then, or the bridge, and then have the scale of the skyline. And it was an interesting conversation with the community where we went back to them and said, allow us to build taller buildings, but actually build buildings that give you more parkland, more affordable housing, and a better sort of neighborhood in terms of the streets. And we got community board approval 29-3, actually, for this plan, which many of you may have read about in the New York Times. We did this with Lisa Switkin, who's a landscape architect from Field Operations, this glorious 6.5-acre park. And the first building is now under construction. And one of the first things that we talked about is, in being able to shift the plan this way, we went from about 5 acres to almost 7 acres of new public open space connected on a public grid. Everything's completely public. Lisa worked hard with the community in terms of the different kinds of activities that could happen on that park. We really wanted to celebrate the refinery. The refinery is extraordinary, although if you take a tour of it, you will never eat refined sugar again. But the notion that by building these buildings taller and slimmer, you could get this great park front, and that you could celebrate the volume, that big muscular mass of that refinery, and celebrate the history of Brooklyn. And part of Lisa's design actually incorporates a lot of the artifacts that are in and around the refinery today and uses them and scatters them throughout the park. I think this was critical, this notion that it's specific. This is of, by, and for Williamsburg. It can't be in Dubai. It can't be in Shanghai. It is specific to this place. And I think that's one of the things people long for when they see development. They want something that actually reflects their neighborhood and their community. And so this is the artifact walk that we're talking about. But then the big deal here, in terms of my first point, is that this is going to be one of the most mixed-use projects in the city, with 600,000 square feet of new tech space in both the refinery and one of the new buildings. And people are tired of using a very crowded L train to get to work in Manhattan. They want places for creative industries and entrepreneurialism to grow in Brooklyn. And so that, tied with the fact that it's all independent retail, no big box stores. There's this great moment where a guy from a record store who was at a community board meeting said, listen, my record store, I can't afford the rent anymore. Jed walked up to him, took his card, said, let's figure out a way to get you into the project. And so this is something that I think is really critical, and it's the same actual idea with the affordable housing. So there's not only 700 units of affordable housing, but the idea that a poor door is a social abomination, right? We should be able to celebrate having mixed income housing in our city. And so everything is completely mixed throughout the development. No, the construction crews don't even know what's an affordable housing unit and what's a market rate unit. And so there'll be none of this, these kind of garage buildings that are tacked onto the back of luxury developments where if you live in this building, you can't even use the gym and the other amenities in the tower. So we're totally doing away with that model. And we're also doing away with this monotonous architecture that seems to have creeped like a fungus over our waterfront. And instead said, instead of having this city that sort of flat lines where you only have one height and everyone has to dictate that you can only have that one height, that instead, let's have a Brooklyn with a heartbeat. Let's have a city that has a skyline that says this is one of the greatest places in the world. It deserves its own exuberance as a skyline. And it should be different than Manhattan's skyline. It should be specific to this place. Because imagine if Manhattan, if you did this and made every tower the same height. I mean, this is the way some city planners think. Is this the city that people write postcards about? And so this is what we're talking about. And one of the most interesting things in the conversation with the community was this idea that these buildings were not all glass, but could be industrial. The first building's under design right now, what we call the baby donut, that's copper and zinc. And it, again, is supposed to be evocative of the materials of Brooklyn. So this is underway. We think it's really exciting. It's going to be beautiful. And I think it's part of what's next. Thanks very much.